Hello, Christopher here. What I'm looking at offering in this video is a perspective on the current lockdown that we have in New Zealand, and I know many are experiencing around the world. What I find with periods like this, looking at it from a personal growth or self-development point of view, and how to handle and look at it constructively. When I look at people that have made significant periods of growth in their life, it's usually when they've had accidents or various things have happened where much of what they've known as life has been stripped away. And at the moment, many of us find this, that our jobs are no longer applicable for the moment anyway. Some of us have lost our jobs permanently. Our social interactions have changed, our personal interactions may have changed. Just how we experience the world has changed. Through this, there is that sense of unfamiliarity which can be quite destabilising, because a lot of what we know and that we occupied both our time and our world with has gone or changed. And what we often experience is that sense of void. We think of it as a sense of loss, but there's actually like a void, there's this emptiness where the activity was, that now there is no thing there. And it's this concept of things that we have in our life, how we occupy ourselves with things, whether it be activity things, material things, or mental things, whether it be thoughts, thinking. When our world has changed, we have different thoughts being triggered, and we have different responses, because most of our thoughts are repetitious, often based on the routines we established during the day. So they have a familiarity, we know what to expect at what time of the day. Whereas at the moment, much of that has changed. So we're in this unknown and unfamiliar space. And some of us at times, when we get into that unfamiliar, we find it both destabilising and it can be scary because of that unfamiliar response. In the old days, when we were doing the hunter-gatherer thing, our conditioned responses of fearing the unknown did keep us safe to a degree. We didn't want to be chased by a woolly mammoth or saber-toothed tiger, so being cautious about the unfamiliar sound, noise, movement often did keep us safe. Whereas nowadays, we don't have those same threats, but the unknown and unfamiliar can still bring up a fear response. So once we've had so many changes, these responses can be triggered just by the current situation. Now what I'm offering is those who I've met before, usually in individual cases where life has changed significantly, often through accident or extreme life-changing event. When they get into the unfamiliar, they often describe that sense of emptiness or hollowness or silence, or they describe it as there is just nothing there. Now that concept of nothing, if we get into it, and often when I've taken people into it, what they find, their statement is correct. There is no thing there. But it's that concept of thing that's important, because the space itself exists, and when we're aware of this space where no thing exists, we find we have our own sense of presence. And this is the thing that most of us are not used to being with. And I'm suggesting that if we take the time to become aware of our own sense of presence, we start to establish a greater sense of self, being present in our own sense of presence. Now, what often happens is when we first start going into it, our logical mind comes in very effectively because it's so used to interjecting and offering its perspective. And often it'll continue with an ongoing dialogue because it's really good at doing that. Whether it's coherent or makes sense or not is debatable. But what I'm suggesting is we step back from that dialogue and just observe the sense of presence, that observe space that the presence occupies. So when we have the void in which we feel our own sense of presence, we sit with it. And we find there is an awareness of our own sense of presence. In this awareness of our own sense of presence, we're aware of our own awareness. And once we sit with this, and I'm suggesting we sit with it for a while, it's like a meditation. We're aware of our own awareness and presence, which is our own self-aware presence. And just sit with this. We breathe with it. We observe it as the awareness experiencing its own presence and its own self-aware awareness of its own presence. So we've got two steps there. The awareness of our own awareness and awareness of our own sense of presence. So it becomes self-aware presence. And what is it that is present? We're becoming conscious of our own sense of presence. And if you notice, the word consciousness, hopefully, has a deeper experiential sensation than even awareness does. So we can become, if we sit with it long enough, aware of our awareness and conscious how we're conscious of that awareness. Notice how vast this consciousness is. We can look at how vast and expansive the awareness is. How vast and expansive the presence is. And if you find there is infinite presence, infinite awareness, and infinite consciousness, noticing how they all acknowledge each other, and they're aspects or manifestations of being. So once we have this sense of being, breathing with it, coming to awareness, presence, aware of our own sense of presence. Just breathing with it, letting it be there. Noticing the space in our lives that we now have. Aware of our own presence in this space. Breathing with each in turn, becoming familiar with how they introspect each other. It's like an inner knowing of each other, but yet it's an expansive knowing of our own sense of being. It is aware of its own presence, of our's not quite the right word, the sense of presence. Because you notice when you're aware and you're present, there is actually no sense of ownership. There's no self-identity, there's no separate identity. It's just self-aware presence of our own sense of being. And what we're being is the conscious that is consciously conscious of our own self-aware being. And how they all introspect with each other. It's like they link up and become part of a greater whole. And in that linking, it becomes a consciousness of our own self-aware presence, of our own being, which is where we start to as we match them and watch the interaction, we become conscious of our own self-aware being. Just notice how it feels. If you find your heart at any point enlivening to this or becoming active, acknowledging that experience, allow it to be there, not making anything of it, just letting experience be as it is. Consciously self-aware of our own presence, or consciously conscious of our own sense of being, as we look at the aspects from within the variety of experience we're having in our self-aware presence. So we've got presence, we've got awareness, we've got consciousness, and we've got being. We can focus on one at a time. We've got all the time in the world at the moment, so we can sit with them. We can choose one at a time and make it a whole meditation, breathing with our sense of awareness for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, whatever's comfortable. Notice any reactions to them, and notice it's just a reaction. And most reactions will be based on memory, which is the logical mind trying to come back in again. Might be trying to have a voice. But usually if we just notice that and focus back to the awareness or presence, that logical mind drops out again. Just in the sense of presence, if we stay focused with it, becomes its own space. And the infinite awareness that we have, once we're used to that sense of infinity, there's nothing else interjects in that space. It becomes its own self-fulfilling presence. Notice how awareness is self-aware of its own awareness. Awareness, or awareness of our awareness. It's where awareness experiences itself. It's not observing itself as if it's a separate entity. It's experiencing itself as itself, which is essentially awareness becoming conscious of its own presence. And this is the thing about presence, just the observation of presence. We can see, the awareness of our own awareness, but we can also be aware that we're becoming conscious of our own awareness, and we're becoming conscious of our own sense of presence. Sitting with it. Once again, noticing the sense of infinity that comes with it. If we try and find the edge of awareness, do we find it? If we try and find the edge of awareness or the edge of presence, do we find it? If we try and find the edge of consciousness, do we find it? Now, something to play with here for those who may be ready or willing to try it, and it's often good for experienced practitioners of meditation. When we have awareness, we can be aware of presence, we can be aware of being. But when we're aware of consciousness or in consciousness, does consciousness actually have any of those aspects with it? As if it's parts of it? Or is it just conscious of it as if it's something manifest out there? It's aware of them, but consciousness itself, even though they're made from consciousness when we go into it, doesn't actually have separate components, which is when we get into pure consciousness. If you drift into consciousness, it's like we're going into it, become fully immersed in consciousness, do all these separate identities actually disappear. The identity of awareness, of presence, of being. Or does it just become unlimited, unconditional consciousness? When we come from consciousness, in consciousness, I find drifting in consciousness in its own presence. Even the heart becomes, it's like an incorporated aspect of consciousness, or it's just present but not as a separate thing. The heart essentially stills out and becomes passive because it's not been stimulated by something or by some experience. And we have to watch this. We're not doing this as a sense of sensation stimulation, because that can become an egoic thing. We're looking for something, a stimulation, excitement, an activity of another form. We're just aware of the presence of consciousness itself. And how does it feel slipping through awareness and presence and even the sense of being into consciousness itself? I find there's no sense of self-identity in consciousness. To be in consciousness from which all essentially manifests, we go out of consciousness into the manifestation. But in consciousness itself there is no manifestation. In pure consciousness, to be pure, there is nothing that is separate from consciousness, which is when we come out of consciousness into the world of manifestation, we realize that everything is an aspect of consciousness. Now, we might wonder how this happens. What I find is consciousness itself maintains its own vibration. And love, which often appears as consciousness, when we're looking from the world of things, looking at love, we experience in love its intensity of consciousness. But I find once we're in pure consciousness looking back at the world of manifestation, we've got to come into love to see that which is manifest. Consciousness has a vibration here and love lies straight alongside it, I find. They're in immediate contact, or what I call conversation with each other. It is back to the saying, if you've ever heard it, everything is made from love, with love, by love. The manifestation is actually made from love, not as such directly from consciousness, yet there is a point within consciousness with which everything is manifest. It may sound a bit topsy-turvy, but once you get into pure consciousness, we find consciousness self has an intermediary layer where it's not pure anymore. There's a layer of interaction with love through which the interpretation of consciousness manifests. It's like a layer of conversation between love and consciousness, where consciousness is not completely pure because it's aware of, thus involved in, the world of manifestation. But it's involved in that through love. Love actually does the effort. the intent is within consciousness. And that intent is with the purity of pure consciousness. There is nothing manifest that is not pure consciousness. But to follow it through, to understand what is manifest, is to interpret it through the eyes of love. Which is where love actually has clear seeing, clear understanding, because it knows what it's manifesting and why. And that's because of the clarity of its connection with consciousness. So if we want to understand something, we understand it in a loving heart, through love. Because love is that which sees clearly. It's the one that sees all of creation. Have you ever found when you're really open, you understand things a lot clearer? When we're reactive, we don't understand what we're observing as clearly, because we're getting caught up in that action-reaction, which is programming and memory. But when we're in love itself and just looking from that openness, because you notice to love something you have to be open to it. So openness comes from love, and love is openness. So if we want to be open, it's essentially to be loving. We can't love without openness. So if we interpret love as possessiveness, attachment, or anything else, that's not love. It is just what it is. It's attachment, it's possession, it's clinging. Sometimes it's power over. But if we come back to love itself, love is none of those things. It's openness, it's understanding, it's acceptance, it's compassion. And it's compassionate through its understanding, or through understanding, because it doesn't claim understanding. It's not really its understanding, it's just understanding. Because it knows what's manifest and why. So if we want to understand something, we do it through a loving heart. If we look at it through analytical understanding, that is often based either on memory or interpretation, which is limited by both the interpretation and the memory. So coming back again, we're going to come out of that. Your analytical mind might have started to get involved again. So we'll just come back to where we started, with how things in life at the moment have changed. We have the sense of space or void. And with that space and void, just as we start to breathe with the awareness of it again. Awareness of our own awareness. We've had a brief discussion, so we've looked at some things of understanding, of love. We've looked at the void itself. And the void, when we look at it, is just our own self-aware presence, but not aware of anything. Sometimes we just experience it as awareness. Sometimes I've noticed it has a sense of presence with it, but it's the present moment awareness, aware of our own presence. And when we're aware of that, there is no thing to be aware of. And things are the worlds of manifestation, of memories, of beliefs, of physicality, material goods, activities, brain activity, busyness, occupation of things. But when we let go of all the things, and many of us have had our things removed by this lockdown, we're back in that space of the void. with all our things removed, all our toys taken away. We're encouraged not to use them at the moment as we learn to be comfortable with ourselves in our own space. And we look how much we've been tempted to occupy that space in our home with things, with activities, with busyness. What would happen if we took a moment or a period each day, whether it be 10 minutes, as I said early on, 20 minutes or even an hour, and just be with the stillness? There's lots of things we can do with the awareness, with the sense of presence, and with the sense of consciousness and love itself, once we get used to it. But we find the being, that sense of being that is aware of our own sense of presence, so when we meditate, we know what it is that is meditating. It is the being, our own sense of I am the self-aware presence in this moment. Or if we go deeper, I am the point of consciousness that is aware of my own sense of being in this moment through this body. And I'm being in my own self-aware presence, or I can be in my own consciousness. I can just be in my awareness, my experience of awareness. Awareness is not a thing, it's actually an activity. But it's a still activity, it's just aware. But if we look at it as an activity, it's an activity of consciousness, which is how often we've got to go into awareness to get to consciousness. As I do with all meditations, when I look at this and decide it's time to come out of it, I come back to being aware of where I am, aware of my own body, my own position I'm in, the room I'm in. So I'm orientating myself back to the physical world. And being aware of what it's like to come back to the physical world, the physical focus. We have the inner focus, we might say, through our sense of consciousness, or awareness, or presence, or whatever it is we notice. We're just in a calling. We're coming back to that through our body experience. Often I'll move my body, just rock the position just to get sense of the body again. So I know what I'm orientating to the world through as I experience the world. It's handy to know where your feet are when you start to walk again or get up from your seat and walk. But sometimes as we go into consciousness, awareness, presence, being, or love itself, we can lose that sense of I as the body being. We can lose the sense of even body, which gets quite interesting, which I like. Now, if anybody has any questions with this, you're welcome to ask. This video is offered as a suggestion. It's something we can practice. Using meditation techniques is ideal. If you don't have meditation techniques available, you can contact and I'll look at doing some videos on meditation. It'll be basic meditation or introductions to meditation through breathing techniques in a traditional form. My background I use in this is Theravadan Buddhism, Vipassana, Raj Yoga as my predominant sources. There are various other ones with Satananda Yoga and Yoga Nidra. They are not all the meditation traditions that I've learnt over the years, but they're an introduction to some of them. But the main techniques are those ones. I thank you for those who've watched this and taken the time to partake in it. The idea when watching this video is not to just listen to the words, but listen to where the words are leading suggesting or pointing. It's a self-directed exercise for investigating within our own awareness, with our own sense of void, that sense of space we experienced as our activities were suddenly not there. For some of us, our jobs are not there. So we can't occupy ourselves or think about what we're going to do with the job anymore, because if it's not there, that's gone. So how do we feel just with that sense of space that's left, that void of job, that void of personal activity, that void of social activity? And just experience the presence that's left in the void, the presence of our own self-aware presence, our own consciousness of our own self-aware presence, that sense of being that we're aware of in the sense of presence. And notice this leaves us with an aspect of our own sense of being. What is it like to be a self-aware being? When you're in the infinity of that awareness, of that being, of presence, how does it feel to be an infinite being? If you haven't found the sense of infinity with awareness, you feel free to add comment, and I can come back to that in a later video. But I often find those who get into awareness, and when questioned around it, you'll find very quickly that it is an infinite sense of awareness. The same with presence and the same with being. We just got to focus through the body at the moment, but it's not our only focus. Once we go into it, we find it as an infinite sense of experience of our own awareness and consciousness. Thank you for this. If there's any questions, as I say, you're welcome to ask. And if you have any other subjects you'd like to look at or to know more about, feel free to ask. You can either ask on this video or through my Facebook page. For those who haven't touched base with my Facebook page, I'll leave a link under the video on YouTube. Thank you. Any other questions, feel free to ask at any time.